seeing our liberation touches on every other aspect of change in this country since 1994. And of course, the key outstanding historical issues that rest primarily on the KhoiSan. I'd like to introduce Dr. Don Matera, and probably you will be able to introduce himself much better than I can, except to say that I literally grew up intellectually and politically in the home of Dr. Matera. I think many sitting around this table, especially in the Gauteng area, will attest to the fact that Don Matera has played a key central role in the liberation of South Africa. Besides being a poet, he rescued journalism in this country. He has been a spiritual resource and repository to countless fighters in this country. He has been a pillar of strength to our communities, particularly in Gauteng. He has been a pillar that has transcended ethnicity and has been an intellectual figure, second to none, to those who actually uprooted apartheid under the Nationalist Party. Don Matera has written 16 books, all of great inspiration to the entire South Africa. He's been an inspiration to all our youth, crossing literally every ethnic barrier in terms of knowledge and inspiration. He remains a pillar of strength and a pool of wisdom to our people in this country. And as we know, Don Matera is a patron of the KhoiSan movement, known across the country. And without going further, it's my honor to actually ask Don Matera to do our first introduction to the issue of unity and liberation today. Thank you very much. Basis, administer territory. In South Africa, we've seen how that took place in the most distorted forms through the creation of Bantustans, the co-option of what became indigenous languages, from Zulu, etc., etc. You had radio stations being allowed in Zulu or Sotho, Shangaan, where the language itself, because it has survived, is co-opted into the agenda of the oppressor, into the agenda of the colonialist. That did not happen with the KhoiSan for the simple reason that they took the brunt of the wars against colonization. Both territory, culture, and language had to be dismantled. And whatever emerged in that space could also be co-opted, as has happened with what became known as Afrikaans, which is the Creole. It is a creation, really, of the KhoiSan and the slaves that were brought in the midst of the KhoiSan. That you could even co-opt that language. And we have documentation today for those who are studying history. The documents are available in terms of how Afrikaans was actually co-opted internationally. Literally here in the 1930s, the middle 1930s, where you had the Old Fort Foundation funding the rise of what became white Afrikaner nationalism. that the descendants of the KhoiSan even had to be robbed of a language. It's the most unique language, one of the most recent languages in Africa. Even that had to be usurped and handed over to those who had made peace with colonialism. Literally, the Afrikaner nationalists or the emerging middle class who had conceded imperial space to the British. They considered that the British were dominant, and therefore they were given certain privileges, such as we will give you a language. It is always a question of how a narrative is written. That the British wrote the narrative of Afrikaners becoming Afrikaners. It is not the Afrikaners. And it's an issue that they are very sore at when you point out that Afrikaner nationalism was the creation of British imperialism. And then others will dispute it when you say Zionism, which now rules Israel, is the creation of British imperialism. And it all comes down to the question of space. It comes down to the question of space. Who had actually become the dominant force that dislocated the KhoiSan peoples, their culture and their language? It is the British. And for those of you who are old enough, and Don, I think you'll be able to attest to this, that even whites who became Afrikaners were living among our people. Very long periods. For very, very long periods. Even in the cities like Johannesburg. And from the 1930s onwards, they became the people who now adopted white superiority. It wasn't at one go. It was not at one go. It was a program of British imperialism that needed forces to actually consolidate their state, which South Africa is to this day. And that's why it's important to make the distinction between governments and states. Yes. The South African state is still under the architecture of British rule.
It's true.
To this day.
Yeah.
And if you doubt that, look at how even Madiba had to go and pay homage to the Queen, and how we were taken back into what's called the British Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And you'll see the distinction you have to make in terms of who the KhoiSan are really up in terms of their land claims.
Come on.
You are not just dealing with a government, you are dealing with a state. And it's very important in addressing this question of unity for us not to lose sight of why it is important to understand this distinction between government and state. Because whoever becomes whatever alliance in the next government will still have to abide by the Queen's rules. That's why it's important to understand that KhoiSan land claims cannot be determined by any government. It has to be determined by the Khoi and San on their own.
Yes.
You cannot ask favors. You cannot ask favors because whichever government changes will have to address the question of the state. Because at bottom, unlike what so-called nationalists, black or white, will tell you, is that South Africa did not start on the basis of monoracial groups. The foundation of the Cape was laid on the basis of smashing the KhoiSan and implanting a different group of people who have become the coloureds, the descendants of the KhoiSan. The Cape was never monoracial. If it was from one angle only, British domination. British domination. And that shaped what became modern South Africa. And that's also one of the reasons why you have to marginalize colored people so that they cannot reclaim the land of their ancestors.
Yes.
It's very important to understand that because in real terms, KhoiSan land claims are claims against the British state. Are claims against the British state. The ANC is only a government. It is only a government. And it's very important to understand that because when we became a democratic republic in 1994, socially and politically, the ANC re-embedded the racial hierarchy created by the British into our constitution. And it's very important to go back and check that out. Go back and check it out. Despite being non-racial, the agreement was to reinvent the racial hierarchy created by the British. And when we say created by the British, go and look at the documents of how they dealt with the descendants of the KhoiSan in 1910. In 1910, when they created another USA, the Union of South Africa.
Yes, sir.
The same hierarchy was re-embedded into our constitution. And no matter what constitutional experts are saying or what their narrative is, this is a sensitive issue which is not publicly discussed. Like the Afrikaner nationalists, they could keep their nationalism but leave the state. But all het 4 republieken gehad. They had 4 republics. We have created space for 9, potentially. But of all this fabric, the KhoiSan and their descendants have been pushed aside. Now there's a reason for that. And I think what we have to come to terms with, if we want this unity, we must address this racial hierarchy, which has been socially and economically re-embedded in our constitution. Without that, we are going to be making false alliances and false agreements that will not hold for the next generations. It will not hold. And that's why it's important to address the issue of self, which somehow appears philosophical. When we talk of self, then people think you are going to the dimension of philosophy. No. Because that racial hierarchy guarantees other groups an understanding of who they are in terms of their location within the hierarchy. You will not be a white man in South Africa if you don't have an understanding of that hierarchy. It's as simple as that. If you don't understand that hierarchy of races existing in South Africa, and if you're white, then you don't need to call yourself white, because it's embedded in the identity. It's embedded in the identity. And the narrowing down of the term African to Black African has exactly the same dynamic. Exactly the same dynamic. It's a racial dynamic. And it's no question, you feeling squeamish about it. This is how imperialism is run in South Africa. The masters who created the state want it this way. And if you look carefully, the confusion and the sensitivity about this race hierarchy set in quickest among the so-called colored born frees. They came up with the term, I'm not black enough, I am not white enough. And of course people dismissed it. But when you are free, you possess a self.
True.
because you'll understand your location in the hierarchy. Colored people don't understand their location in this race hierarchy. Never have. Never have. And we can prove it sociologically and philosophically. And more importantly, economically. Start with the question of economic institutions. They have never existed in this country for colored people. Never. And I'd like somebody sociologically, anthropologically, to come and give me an example of such institutions. They have never existed. Even the social institutions that were there were controlled and monitored. And the most prominent symbol is the so-called Coon Carnival, or the Coons, which became the most unique but absolutely dominated cultural institution of colored people. Today it's gone under the democratic state. It's controlled by gangsters, it's been handed over by gangsters, and gangsters are funded to run this, not communities. Not communities. And it's not an accident. But let me get back to the theme, because I just wanted to give a few examples. I think it would be important to say that throughout the world, what became colored people or mixed people have always been prevented to live in terms of who they think they are. When you go to the United States, people who call themselves Black Americans are the most mixed people.
Yeah.
There was something called a Harlem Renaissance in the 30s, which laid a heroic stamp on the term black, which has been appropriated here in South Africa and abused. Because the Harlem Renaissance, Black Renaissance, had nothing to do with skin pigmentation. It was against the one-drop rule. Yeah, it has been racialized to exclude the very people who invented it in the United States, and turned into a racial tool to solidify the racial hierarchy that was built up by the British here. That's how you can distort the history of one group and appropriate it
Yes.
for something else, for some other purposes. Pan-Africanism. Every theorist of Pan-Africanism would be called colored in South Africa today. Every single one of them, from Fanon to Du Bois, had they lived in this country, would have been classified colored. And these are the people that brought about the most significant change in thinking of African people. Yet in South Africa, the descendants of the Khoi are not even allowed to use the term African. Yet we are descendants of the first African people.
Yeah.
And that's how things are turned on their heads by black nationalism in South Africa. And it's a sore point because the same dynamic of denying, alienating colored people from their heritage, from their ancestry, is at play even in this democracy. Even in this democracy. And that's why reclaiming the South is so critical, and it's going to shape the pillars of the state once it is internalized against the structures of misidentity. But let's look at the issue of why this unity and the reclaiming of the South is important. We have to look at the four faces of race. Race has four faces, particularly in relation to people with the type of pedigree we have. And I agree with everybody who says race is socially constructed. There's no real biological sense to race. It doesn't exist. But unfortunately, because of the structures that have been created by European imperialism or Western imperialism, the entire world has become racialized. Not just this country. the entire world has become racialized. Religions have become racialized. And I think there's no more racist country than South Africa. In fact, the second one would be the United States. They had the same name until the Afrikaner nationals changed it to Republic. Same ideology, same group that dominates. So it's very important to understand, even though it is socially constructed, because the issue that always comes up when colored people have to get together to discuss heritage or their social conditions or circumstances is that these people are busy conniving to become racist or expressing racism. The greatest victims of racism are accused of racism.
Yeah.
Come on.
Come on
Yes.
now.
Yes.
And some of us become intimidated, ons wakkel, die knieë word swak. As mense sê jy is rassiste. We had the most recent experience in Davidsonville, but we took them on and they withdrew, where the entire community was declared racist for protesting against corruption, lack of governance, mismanagement. They took what they call the African child and bust them all over the place and left the colored children to their own devices. This was done, and I'm not afraid to say because I addressed it publicly, that the premier of Gauteng actually came out there with busloads of thugs to intimidate all colored people. And I mean, I've got witnesses here. These old people were shot. But if the community didn't stand its ground, the rest of the colored communities would have been declared racist if they just raised their voices. So it's very important to understand why these things are done. Individuals can't determine what race is on their own. Regardless of what you think of yourself, you can't decide, I am not classified this. This is one of the challenges of the KhoiSan movement. Because the weight of this hierarchy has convinced perhaps the majority of colored people they are not descendants of the KhoiSan. And that has been the function of colonialism. Because with the hierarchy goes socialization. You are socialized as a white man. You are socialized as before it was Bantu, now it's African, black African, and colored. People say colors are confused. The truth is, everybody lives under this hierarchy. It's just, and colored. People say colors are confused. The truth is, everybody lives under this hierarchy. It's just that it's become a bit more polished now, that you can use the term black African. But white remains. No one touches white. No one touches white. You're not allowed to diagnose whiteness. But the strange thing is that under this government, coloreds find themselves at the end of the stick, being stigmatized as racists. Yet they are the greatest victim in the history of the creation of race ideology in this country, if not in Africa.
Yes.
And the unfortunate thing is, coloreds don't understand, or the majority of us have not been taught to understand the dynamics of race hierarchy. And one of the greatest tragedies in these ghettos is that our males turn on themselves because they do not understand those dynamics. They don't understand those dynamics. Because if they had, this country would be ungovernable. And that's not a light statement. So one of the key things of understanding race, as Du Bois called it, you must understand the veil if you have been put under the veil as a colored. And W.E. Du Bois was the first sociologist that actually solved that for us, but you will not find his books in school. He dealt with the very same problems that the descendants of the KhoiSan are dealing with, and he called it the veil. That once you take off the veil, you will begin to address the loss of self, the loss of selfhood, the loss of self-determination.
That's right, sir.
Because self-determination flows from the restoration of self.
Yes.
That's why African Americans became African Americans. They moved from colored to Black American to African American. It's a process of restoring the self, and we have a lot to learn from that process. Unlike when African Americans come to South Africa, they are told these are the worst people. They point to colored spots, colored townships, etc., etc. This is a cancer. Yet those people have resolved issues that we have to resolve. And we also have to resolve it, and this is the contradiction, we have to resolve it for Black African people.
Yes.
We have to resolve it for Black African people.
That's right, sir.
Because that liberation process is not complete among those who are called Black African, who have renamed themselves Black African. It is not complete. It's a distorted narrative. And the reason I tell you that, Thabo Mbeki fashioned himself to be an Africanist. But in everything he did, there's only one sentence devoted to the KhoiSan. One sentence. But you cannot have an Afrocentrism without the KhoiSan, unfortunately.
Right, sir.
You can call yourself the blackest this or that. You cannot have an Afrocentrism without colored people, if you want to put it straightforwardly. You cannot. It's like an Africa without legs. It's a false nationalism. And it's bound to lead to disaster. And one of those disasters is the return of tribalism in a vicious way in this country. Because as long colors are, or the descendants of the Khoi are invisible, you can practice this fraud. That you have an African nationalism that denies the descendants of the KhoiSan their self-determination. It cannot be. It cannot be. The only reason it appears to be is because you are playing to the tune of British imperialism. You are playing to the tune of your London masters. That is the only reason. So one has to understand that in being socially constructed, the individual cannot decide which race he or she belongs to. The hierarchy is already set. That is why it's false for anybody to offer colors within the context of this democracy a fabricated blackness, a convenient blackness. It is a lie, and it can only be committed against people who have no sense of self. That is why this black economic empowerment, if you want us to tell the blatant truth, does not even come from the minds of Black Africans. And there's documents to prove it. Yet it is used a tool to marginalize. But who is being protected in the process? It's dominant British and American interests. Dominant British and American interests. Because the classification of colonialism has remained.
Yeah.
Yes.
It has remained.
Not even intensified.
Exactly. It has remained. You are still classified as colored. Whether you are conveniently given the title of black or not. It's a convenience.
What?
And it's convenience only because these people have not reclaimed the self. Because no one can tell you who you are once you are awoken to who you truly are in terms of heritage, culture, etc., etc. To the extent it hasn't happened, it has to be laid foursquare at the door of colonialism and imperialism. And now you ask why? But we've got democracy, we've got freedom. The issue is you still do not decide who you are in terms of the embedded classification that has been re-embedded politically, socially, and economically. You can play around romantically and say I'm this or that, but the hard social fact is, the old colonial classification rests on us. It rests on us. So die stof wat in ons oog gegooi word en sê ons dink dit is ook swart. It's a convenient game. Because in harsh social terms, and when we compare our experience, we will find that it's a different truth. We will discover it's a different truth. The other issue that one has to understand in a racialized society, race is something you do.
Yes.
You can't have abstract race. It's the abstract.
Yeah.
And you can't do dodgy tricks around it. It is something you do. And you do it within yourself, the internal conversation, and you do it with people that you interact with daily. Because racial ideology works on an interactive basis. You try and go and talk race with a gorilla in Congo, they'll smash your head off. I mean it literally. Race can only be done interactively among so-called human beings.
Yes.
There's no sense other than among human beings. And because it's hierarchical, it has consequences. It has consequences because the higher up in the hierarchy, the greater your sense of self. It is guaranteed. The hierarchy guarantees it. But you can be robbed of the self the lower you are in that hierarchy. But the important point is, you cannot act out race as an individual. You cannot even act it out with animals because it's nonsensical. It has to be placed in a hierarchy. And that hierarchy has a history of its own. There was genocide, there was land usurpation, and there was classification. Without these elements, you cannot rob anybody of their self. That is why it's important when we address the issue of what politicians are offering us. The first question you have to ask, have I regained myself as a KhoiSan? It's very simple. Does this offering guarantee me reclaiming my heritage? Does it guarantee that? Does it change the hierarchy that has been established by white British colonialism? We know the Afrikaners are very satisfied. They will fight you and I if we're going to change the hierarchy. We know that because they have been guaranteed land ownership. They have been guaranteed land ownership. And they've been guaranteed land ownership that has been taken, usurped, from our KhoiSan ancestors. It's very important to understand that. Now, the most critical part of what the